Hey Reddit, I've never really posted on here before, but after everything that's happened, I feel like I need to get this out. Maybe someone else has been through something similar, or maybe you'll think I'm crazy. Either way, I can't keep this bottled up anymore. So let me start by saying that I've always been a curious person. You know those people who can't resist pressing the do not touch button? Yeah, that's me. Blame it on too many late-night YouTube binges of creepy videos and internet mysteries. One night, about 2 months ago, I was scrolling through Reddit, reading stories about the deep web. I thought it was all exaggerated, people finding hitmen for hire websites, drug markets, stuff like that. I figured it was just a myth, or maybe just the sketchier side of the internet that I'd never stumble across. But then I found this comment that changed everything. Some guy was talking about a specific Tor link saying, it's not what's on the site itself, it's the messages you start getting after you visit. I knew I shouldn't mess with that stuff, but like I said, curiosity. Downloading the Tor browser was easy. Too easy, honestly. I followed a couple of guides, and within an hour, I was staring at the black screen of what's called the hidden wiki. It felt anticlimactic, almost boring. But then I found the link. It didn't have a name, just a random string of letters and numbers. I don't know what I was expecting when I clicked on it. Maybe some creepy old school forum or one of those red room scams people talk about. What I got was just weird. It was a plain black web page with one sentence at the top. Curiosity will be your downfall. And then below it, a single box to enter your email address. Now I know what you're thinking. Why the hell would you put your email into a dark website? Trust me, I've been kicking myself for that ever since. But at the time, I wasn't thinking straight. I thought, what's the worst that could happen? Spam emails? So I typed in my throwaway Gmail and hit enter. For a second, nothing happened. Then the screen went black and a message popped up. We know who you are. Check your inbox. I immediately closed the browser. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking. I wanted to believe it was some dumb prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just made a huge mistake. Against my better judgment, I opened my Gmail. There was an email waiting for me. No subject line, no sender, just an attachment. The attachment was a photo of me. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a picture of me sitting at my desk looking at my screen. It was taken from the angle of my bedroom window. I felt like my stomach had dropped out of my body. I spun around and yanked my curtains closed, but the rational part of my brain was screaming at me. How had they taken that photo? My blinds had been half closed, and my window faces the second floor of my neighbor's house. I deleted the email immediately and told myself it had to be some sort of coincidence, maybe an old webcam photo that had been floating around online. But deep down, I knew better. The next few days were weird. I felt like I was being watched constantly. Every time I left my house, I had this prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was following me. I stopped going out at night altogether. Even going to Starbucks with friends felt like a risk. I mentioned it to my roommate, Danny, but he just laughed it off. Dude, you're freaking yourself out. You probably fell for some phishing scam. Just change your passwords and move on. So that's what I did. I wiped my computer, changed every password I could think of, and blocked the email address. For a little while, I convinced myself it was over until the letters started showing up. It started small. Just a single piece of paper slipped under my door one morning. No return address. All it said was, stop looking. I showed it to Danny, and he gave me the same skeptical look. Bro, it's probably one of your weird friends messing with you. Didn't you say you told Jacob about the dark web thing? Sounds like his kind of prank. But Jacob swore it wasn't him. And over the next week, the letters kept coming. They started appearing in random places, taped to the inside of my car windshield, stuck to my locker at the gym, even stuffed inside a McDonald's bag I threw out. Each one said the same thing: stop looking. The final straw was last Tuesday. I was walking home from work, broad daylight, middle of a crowded street, and I got this text. It was from an unknown number, and it just said, "Look to your left." I froze. My heart felt like it was about to explode. Against my better judgment, I turned my head. There was a man standing on the corner, staring directly at me. He was wearing this black hoodie pulled low over his face, but I could see just enough to notice something wrong. His face was pale, like too pale, and his eyes didn't blink. Not once. He didn't move either, just stood there, watching me. I didn't even realize I'd started running until I was halfway down the block. I didn't stop until I made it to my apartment, slammed the door, and locked every single bolt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up watching my security camera feed, waiting for something to happen. Around 3 a.m., I finally started to doze off. And that's when my phone buzzed again. The text read, "This is your final warning. Stop, or you'll lose everything." That text, "This is your final warning. Stop, or you'll lose everything," shook me to my core, but I convinced myself that if I just ignored it, things would eventually blow over. I mean, that's what you do with bullies, right? You don't give them attention, and they move on to the next victim. But this wasn't a playground bully. This was something darker, something I couldn't just wait out. The next morning, I woke up to find my front door unlocked. Now, let me be clear, I always triple-check the locks before I go to bed. Living in the city, it's just something you do, but here it was, wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Nothing in the apartment seemed out of place, which somehow made it even worse. No signs of a break-in, no missing valuables, just my door, wide open, like someone wanted me to know they'd been inside but didn't want to leave any clues. I called Danny immediately. He wasn't home that night. He'd been crashing at his girlfriend's place. But when I told him what happened, he said I was being paranoid again. "Maybe you forgot to lock it," he said with a yawn. "Or maybe the wind blew it open." The wind. Right. I didn't buy it, but I didn't push the issue. Danny had always been the laid-back type, and honestly, I didn't blame him for not wanting to get involved. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me while I slept. Things escalated 2 days later. I was at work when I got another text from the unknown number. This time, it wasn't just a threat, it was a photo. It was a picture of my family, my mom, dad, and little sister, sitting together in their living room. My mom was on the couch with her glasses perched on her nose, reading a book. My dad was reclined in his chair, asleep with the remote in his hand. My sister was sprawled out on the rug, scrolling on her phone. It was so mundane, so normal, except for the fact that the photo was taken through their living room window. And the worst part? They live over 600 miles away. I called my mum immediately. She picked up after a few rings, sounding groggy but fine. "Sweetie, what's wrong?" she asked. I didn't want to freak her out, so I just asked if she'd noticed anything unusual lately. She said no strange cars parked outside, no weird phone calls, nothing. I told her to keep her doors locked and hung up, my heart pounding. When I checked my phone again, there was a second text waiting for me. "Do you believe us now?" That night, I stayed awake again, glued to the security camera feed. I'd finally broken down and installed a couple of cheap cameras around the apartment after the door incident. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better. Around 2 a.m., the motion detector went off. I sat up straight, my pulse racing as I pulled up the feed. At first, I couldn't see anything. The camera outside my front door showed an empty hallway. Then, just as I was about to relax, a figure stepped into view. It was the same guy from before, the one with the black hoodie. He stood perfectly still in front of my door, staring directly at the camera. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his head was tilted slightly, like he was trying to get a better look at me through the lens. Then, without warning, he raised his hand and pressed a single finger to his lips. Shh. I froze. My mind went blank. Every instinct was screaming at me to call the cops, but I knew they wouldn't take me seriously. Some guy standing in your hallway, so what? And what if they showed up, and he was gone by the time they arrived? I'd look like a paranoid idiot. The man lingered for another minute before finally walking away. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, Danny found me in the kitchen, staring blankly at my coffee mug. "Dude, you look like hell," he said, pouring himself a bowl of cereal. I debated whether to tell him about the camera footage, but decided against it. If he wasn't going to take the letters seriously, he definitely wouldn't believe me about this. That day at work, I couldn't focus on anything. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, half expecting another photo or text. My boss even called me out for zoning out during a meeting, but I didn't care. All I could think about was the man in the hallway and the fact that he knew where I lived. When I got home that evening, the apartment felt off. Nothing was out of place, but the air was heavy, like someone had been there recently. I checked all the locks, made sure the windows were latched, and turned on every light in the apartment. Then, just as I was about to settle in for another sleepless night, I got a call from my mum. Her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. "Honey, something's wrong," she said. We came home and the house it's been ransacked. Everything's trashed. Your dad called the police, but I just feel so scared." My blood turned to ice. I tried to calm her down, asking if anything was missing. She said no, nothing valuable had been taken, just furniture overturned, cabinets emptied, papers scattered everywhere, like someone was sending a message. While she was talking, I got another text. This one wasn't a photo, it was a video. It showed my family's house, the same chaos my mum had just described. The camera panned slowly across the living room, the overturned furniture, the shattered picture frames. Then it zoomed in on the wall above the fireplace, where someone had spray-painted a message in jagged red letters. He didn't listen. I wanted to throw up. I told my mum to stay at a friend's house for the night and hung up. Then I finally did what I should have done days ago. I called the police. Of course, I left out the part about the dark web and the threatening texts. I just told them someone had been stalking me and my family. They sent an officer to take a report, but I could tell he wasn't taking me seriously. "Probably just a prank," he said with a shrug. "Let us know if anything else happens." Anything else. Like this was all normal. The next morning, Danny didn't show up for breakfast. I thought maybe he'd stayed at his girlfriend's place again, but when I texted her, she said she hadn't seen him. His car was still parked outside, so I went to his room and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, before finally pushing the door open. His room was empty. Not empty like he wasn't there. Empty like he'd never existed. His bed was stripped, his desk cleared off, his closet completely bare. The only thing left was a single piece of paper lying in the middle of the floor. I picked it up with trembling hands. "He's gone. You're next." At this point, I don't even know what's real anymore. Danny's just gone. No one I've talked to remembers him, not even his girlfriend. It's like he was erased from existence, and now I'm completely alone. I know they're coming for me next, and I don't think there's anything I can do to stop them. After Danny disappeared, things spiraled into a place that I can barely even put into words. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was like reality itself had fractured. My roommate, my friend, he was gone. Not just missing, but completely erased. His social media accounts deleted. Every photo I had of him on my phone, gone. His name wasn't on the lease, his mail stopped coming, and even his girlfriend swore she'd never heard of him. I spent the next 2 days locked in my apartment, trying to piece together what was happening. I barely ate, barely slept. Every noise outside my door felt like the beginning of the end. The texts kept coming, but they'd shifted in tone. They weren't warnings anymore, they were taunts. One of them read, "Still curious, aren't you?" Another simply said, "Run." But the worst one came the morning after Danny vanished. I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. Groggy and on edge, I grabbed it off the nightstand. There was a new message. This time, it had an attachment. I opened it, my hands trembling. It was a live streaming link. My heart stopped. I hesitated for a moment before clicking it. The screen went black, and then the feed began to load. What I saw made me drop my phone. It was my parents' house. The camera was set up in their living room, pointed at the couch. My mum and dad were tied up, gagged and blindfolded, their heads slumped forward. My mum was shaking uncontrollably, and my dad looked like he'd been hit. His temple was bruised and bleeding. Behind them stood a man in the same black hoodie I'd seen before, his face obscured. I scrambled to pick up my phone, my fingers fumbling as I tried to call the police. Before I could hit the call button, the feed froze for a moment and cut to a close-up shot of the hooded man's face. His eyes, cold, lifeless and unblinking, stared directly into the camera. Then slowly, he pulled a knife from his pocket and ran the blade across his palm, letting the blood drip onto the floor. Beneath the video feed, a new message appeared. Play along, or they die. I didn't know what to do. I was alone in my apartment, shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. My first instinct was to call the cops, but what could I tell them? That someone was live streaming my parents being held hostage? They wouldn't believe me, not after how dismissive they'd been about the earlier threats. And then, as if reading my mind, I got another text. No police. Follow the instructions. Check your mailbox. My mailbox. That meant whoever this was had been here, physically here. They were watching me. I didn't want to go outside, but I didn't have a choice. I threw on a hoodie, shoved my phone in my pocket, and bolted for the door. Every step down the hallway felt like a death march. When I reached the mailbox, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Inside was a single envelope. No return address, just my name, scrawled across the front in jagged handwriting. I tore it open and pulled out a folded piece of paper. On it, in the same messy script, was a single line. You have 24 hours to prove your loyalty. Loyalty? To what? To them? I had no idea what they meant, but I didn't have time to figure it out. My phone buzzed again, and this time the text was more specific. 10 p.m., the corner of 12th and Main. Bring the envelope. By the time night rolled around, I felt like I was losing my mind. I paced my apartment, glancing at the clock every few minutes. I didn't want to go, but what choice did I have? My parents' lives were on the line. So, at 9:30, I grabbed the envelope, stuffed it in my jacket pocket, and headed out. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're walking into a trap. When I reached the corner of 12th and Main, I half expected to find someone waiting for me. But the street was empty, save for a single parked car, a black SUV with tinted windows. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do, when the passenger side window rolled down. A gloved hand extended out, beckoning me forward. My stomach dropped. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't, not with my family's lives on the line. As I approached the car, the hand gestured for the envelope. I pulled it out of my pocket and hesitated for a moment before handing it over. The hand disappeared inside the car, and then the window rolled back up. For a second, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. It wasn't the guy in the hoodie. This man was older, maybe in his 50s, with slicked back grey hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He was wearing a tailored suit, the kind that screamed money and power, but there was something off about him. His eyes, they had the same dead, unblinking stare as the hooded man's. He didn't say a word. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a phone. He held it up, showing me the screen. It was another live feed of my parents. This time, they weren't tied up. They were sitting on the couch, their hands free, but they looked terrified. My mum was sobbing, and my dad was trying to calm her down. The man in the suit turned the phone around and tapped the screen. The camera zoomed out, revealing that the hooded man was still there, standing in the corner with his knife. The suited man handed me the phone and pointed to the screen. Beneath the video feed, a new message appeared. "Prove yourself. You know what to do." I stared at the message, my mind racing. Prove myself? What the hell did that mean? I looked up at the man, but he just stood there, expressionless. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket again and pulled out a gun. He didn't point it at me. Instead, he handed it to me. The weight of it felt wrong in my hands, heavy and cold. The man stepped back, gesturing for me to follow him. I didn't want to. I wanted to drop the gun and run, but my legs wouldn't move. He led me to a side alley where a second man was kneeling on the ground, his hands tied behind his back. He was blindfolded, his head bowed. The suited man pointed to the kneeling man and then to the gun in my hands. The message was clear. I shook my head, backing away. I can't do this," I whispered. The suited man didn't react. He just pointed to the phone, which I was still holding. The live feed zoomed in on my parents again. The hooded man raised his knife, holding it inches from my dad's throat. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear. It felt like hours. Finally, the suited man took a step toward me, his expression darkening. He raised a finger and dragged it slowly across his throat. Time's up. What happened next is a blur. I heard a gunshot, my own hand pulling the trigger, and the kneeling man collapsed. I dropped the gun and stumbled back, the weight of what I'd just done hitting me like a freight train. The suited man picked up the phone and showed me the screen again. My parents were safe, for now. Then he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the alley with the body. That's when I realized the game had just begun. And I was the one who'd agreed to play. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. After what I'd done in that alley, the thought of returning to my apartment felt suffocating. I ended up wandering the streets for hours, my mind replaying the moment over and over again, the crack of the gun, the way the kneeling man's body hit the ground like a puppet whose strings had been cut. My hands were still shaking, my clothes damp with cold sweat. I stopped at a 24-hour diner around 3 a.m., hoping a cup of coffee might help me pull myself together. The place was mostly empty, just a couple of truckers at the counter and an exhausted waitress who barely looked up when I walked in. I found a booth in the corner and sank into the seat, trying to steady my breathing. For a moment, I almost felt normal again. The fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of stale fries, it all felt mundane, like the nightmare I'd been living couldn't reach me here. But then my phone buzzed. I didn't want to look. I knew it wouldn't be good, but ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. Not after what they'd done to Danny, to my parents, to me. I pulled the phone out of my pocket and stared at the screen. It wasn't a text this time, it was a video call. The caller ID was blank. My heart pounded as I accepted the call. For a moment, the screen was black. Then the feed flickered to life, and I found myself staring into a pair of cold, dead eyes. It was the hooded man. He was sitting in a dimly lit room, his face partially obscured by shadow. Behind him I could make out something hanging on the wall, a mask like the kind you'd see in some old cult horror movie. Its features were grotesque, exaggerated and eerily lifelike. The man didn't speak, he just stared at the camera, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. Then the screen shifted and I realized he wasn't alone. The camera panned to show my parents again. They were sitting on the floor, their hands tied behind their backs. My mum was crying softly, and my dad was glaring at the camera, his jaw clenched. And then the hooded man spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You're making progress," he said, "but you still have a long way to go." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my mind racing. The man tilted his head slightly like he was studying me. "You'll receive your next instruction soon," he said. "Don't disappoint us." Before I could respond, the call ended. The screen went black, and I was left staring at my own reflection. I stayed at the diner until dawn, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. I couldn't bring myself to leave. Every time I thought about stepping outside, I felt like I was being watched. The paranoia was eating me alive. When the sun finally came up, I forced myself to leave. I needed answers, something, anything, that could help me figure out who these people were and what they wanted. But where the hell was I supposed to start? The cops wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, what could they do against this? These people weren't just stalkers or criminals. They were organized, methodical. They had resources, they had power, and they had my family. I decided to start with my laptop. If I could retrace my steps back to that dark website, maybe I could figure out what I'd gotten myself into. But when I booted up my computer, I found that my desktop was completely wiped. Every file, every program, even my operating system gone. In its place was a single text file labeled "Stop Looking." I clicked on it, my stomach twisting into knots. The file contained a single line of text: "We control everything. Don't test us." The next few days were a blur of fear and confusion. I stopped going to work, stopped talking to anyone. My phone became my lifeline, and every time it buzzed, my heart skipped a beat. Most of the messages were vague, cryptic. But then 3 days after the diner incident, I received another package. It was waiting for me outside my apartment door, a plain brown box with no return address. I stared at it for a long time before finally picking it up and bringing it inside. I set it on the kitchen table and opened it carefully, half expecting it to explode. Inside was a mask. It was identical to the one I'd seen in the video call, grotesque, lifelike, and deeply unsettling. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it with trembling hands and read the message. "Put it on. Your next task awaits." I didn't want to do it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to throw the mask in the trash and run as far away as I could, but I knew I couldn't, not with my parents' lives hanging in the balance. So I put it on. The moment the mask touched my face, my phone buzzed. Another text, this time with an address. "Warehouse 47, midnight. Come alone." The warehouse was on the outskirts of town, in an industrial area that had long since been abandoned, the kind of place where no one would hear you scream. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, the mask tucked under my arm. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional sound of a distant train. When I reached the warehouse, the door was already open. Inside, the space was dimly lit, with rows of crates and machinery casting long, eerie shadows. In the center of the room was a single chair, and in the chair was a man. He was gagged and blindfolded, his hands tied to the armrests. He looked terrified, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he struggled against the restraints. As I stepped closer, I noticed something familiar about him. My stomach dropped. It was my boss. I didn't have time to process what was happening before a voice echoed through the warehouse. It was the hooded man again, his voice distorted, like he was speaking through a microphone. "You're almost there," he said. "One more step, and your family will be free." I spun around, trying to find the source of the voice, but I was alone. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted. "What do you want from me?" The man laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. "This isn't about what we want," he said. "It's about what you're willing to do." A spotlight clicked on, illuminating a table a few feet away. On the table was a knife. My heart sank. "You know what to do," the voice said. I looked at my boss, who was now shaking his head frantically, muffled cries escaping through the gag. I couldn't do this. I couldn't keep playing their game. But then I thought about my parents, my mum's sobs, my dad's defiant glare. If I didn't do this, they'd pay the price. I picked up the knife. I won't go into detail about what happened next. I can't. The memory is too raw, too horrifying. All I'll say is that when it was over, I was covered in blood, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. The voice came back, calm and detached. "Good," it said. "You're learning." The spotlight clicked off, and the warehouse was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the chair was empty. My boss was gone, as if he'd never been there in the first place. The voice spoke one last time. "Go home. We'll be in touch." And then there was silence. When I got home that night, I felt like a shell of myself. Every step back to my apartment was heavy, like my body knew it was walking toward the end of something, either my sanity or my life. The blood on my hands had dried by the time I reached my door, but the smell lingered, metallic, sour. No amount of scrubbing under the bathroom faucet could get rid of it. It felt like it was inside me now, woven into my very being. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I just sat in the dark, staring at the mask they'd made me wear, now sitting on my kitchen counter. Its hollow eyes stared back at me, as if mocking me for everything I'd done. The silence in my apartment was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. For the first time in days, my phone was silent. No buzzing, no cryptic texts, just nothing. But that silence didn't last long. At exactly 3 a.m., my phone lit up. The screen glowed with a single notification. Final task. I didn't want to open it. My hands shook as I hovered over the message. Part of me hoped that if I ignored it, the nightmare would just end. But I knew better. These people had already proven they could reach me anywhere, at home, at work, even through my family. There was no escaping them. I tapped on the message. 6 a.m. Meet us at St. Anthony's Cemetery, plot 47, bring the mask. The cemetery was on the edge of town, tucked away behind a dense line of trees. It was the kind of place you'd drive past without ever noticing, its wrought iron gates rusting with age. I pulled into the empty gravel lot at 5:45 a.m., the sky just starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The air was cold and damp, clinging to my skin like a warning. I brought the mask with me, tucked under my arm like some cursed artifact. As I stepped through the gates, the gravel crunching beneath my boots felt deafening in the stillness. I made my way toward plot 47, my breath visible in the morning chill. The graves were old, their headstones weathered and cracked. Some of them leaned at odd angles, as if even the dead had tried to escape this place. When I reached the plot, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was a freshly dug grave. The hole was deep, at least 6 feet, and next to it was a wooden coffin. It was open, the lid propped against the side of the grave. The sight of it made my stomach churn. It wasn't just the coffin itself, it was the fact that it looked prepared for me. I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me and spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The hooded man was there, standing just a few feet away. He wasn't alone this time. Beside him was the suited man, the one who had given me the gun in the alley. And behind them, partially hidden in the shadows, were others. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. "Good morning," the hooded man said, his voice calm, almost cheerful. "We're so glad you could join us." What is this?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. "This," the suited man said, gesturing to the grave, "is your final task." I looked at the grave, then back at them. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not doing this. I've done everything you've asked." "You misunderstand," the hooded man interrupted, his tone sharp. "The task isn't for you to dig the grave. The task is for you to lie in it." I froze. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice cracking. The hooded man stepped closer, his expression hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. "You've proven your loyalty. You've sacrificed. You've obeyed. But loyalty isn't just about action, it's about surrender, complete and total surrender." The suited man held up my phone, the screen glowing with a new message. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. My parents. This was the final leverage, the final nail in the coffin, literally. "If you get in the coffin," the hooded man said, "your family will be free. No more games, no more threats. This all ends here." "And if I don't?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The suited man tilted his head, his cold eyes narrowing. "If you don't, we'll bury them instead." I stared at the coffin, my mind racing. Could I trust them? They'd lied to me before, manipulated me, twisted me into something I barely recognized. But what choice did I have? If I didn't do this, my family would die, and it would be my fault. The hooded man reached into his pocket and pulled out a syringe. "We'll make it easy for you," he said, holding it up to the dim light. "Just one little prick, and you'll drift off. No pain, no struggle." I wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, my body refusing to move. Slowly, I reached out and took the syringe from him. My fingers closed around it, trembling. The hooded man stepped back, giving me space. The others were watching, their silent presence more oppressive than any words could have been. I climbed into the coffin, the wood cold and unyielding against my back. My breath came in shallow gasps as I held the syringe over my arm, the needle hovering just above my skin. "Do it," the hooded man said, his voice soft but commanding. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face, and pressed the needle into my arm. Darkness came quickly. My body felt heavy, like I was sinking into the earth itself. I could hear faint voices around me, muffled and distant, like they were speaking through water. And then, silence. When I woke up, I wasn't in the coffin anymore. I was in my apartment. At first, I thought it was a dream. The sunlight streaming through the windows, the familiar smell of my coffee maker. It all felt surreal. But when I checked my phone, there were no new messages, no photos, no videos. It was as if none of it had ever happened. I ran to the living room and turned on the TV. The local news was playing, the anchor droning on about traffic and weather. Nothing about my parents, nothing about Danny, nothing about the grave. It was like the world had reset itself. But as I sat there, trying to make sense of it all, I noticed something on the counter. The mask. It was still there, its hollow eyes staring back at me, a silent reminder of everything I'd done. And in that moment I realized the truth. They hadn't let me go, they'd just given me something far worse, the knowledge that they were still out there, watching, waiting, and that no matter how far I ran, I'd never be free. Not really. And now, every time my phone buzzes, my heart stops because I know it's only a matter of time before they call me back.